Hey, this is Joel with American Giants. I thought I'd do this week's episode on the Snerd at the museum. This fascinating history behind that giant. A lot of people don't know it. They go there, they visit the museum, they see the Snerd, and there's a little tiny bit of information at the museum, but I thought it would be cool to do a whole episode about him. He's actually my first muffler man I ever got. So very dear to my heart, and maybe we can talk a little bit about why he looks the way he looks, how he got there, and what his story is. The International Fiberglass Snerd was really a variation of the International Fiberglass Bunyan, the first muffler man that was ever made. And the Snerds came along from a desire to expand the catalog and give customers more options of what they could buy and choose from a wider variety of figures. The Snerds were really made by altering the head. That was the big one. They made this goofy country bumpkin looking head with a big straw hat, a prominent chin, and big jug ears. And then they took the rest of the muffler man and relatively kept it the same. Normally the Snerds, it could have actually bunion legs or the regular cowboy legs with a pant leg going all the way down to the shoe. And they also had patches that were painted on the legs, square patches. And then the torso was exactly the same as the bunions, except it had a unique paint job with suspenders. And this could either come with red shirt and yellow suspenders, or you could reverse that and you could do a yellow shirt with red suspenders. And so there was two different paint schemes you could order your Snerd in. From historical photographs, it really seems like what most people were doing with Snerds, or the desire for a Snerd, came from businesses like putt-putt courses and amusement parks, more of a jovial atmosphere rather than, a business advertising their product. When I look at historical pictures, I really see these guys either holding a golf club or at an amusement park with other rides and Ferris wheels in the background. And so that seems to be what a lot of these early Snerds were used for. We know a few of them ended up at Seaside Heights, at the pier there. So festive environments catered well to the Snerd. In the mid-60s, one of these Snerds, the one that today stands at the American Giants Museum, made its way to Ohio. We don't know a whole lot about that early history, but I do know that it is most likely that he was used in Ohio at a putt-putt course and that he probably held a golf club. At some point, his time at the putt-putt course ended and he was obtained by a hot dog stand, a small building selling hot dogs. And so the Snerd found his way to one of these Coney Island stands, and the Snerd was acquired, and the legs were removed, and most likely disposed of eventually. And the top half, the torso, was put on the roof and anchored down, and so he sat up there with his arms and just his torso, and was on the roof of this Coney Island. At some point in the late 70s, the owners of this Coney Island removed the Snerd and sold him. And what they actually wanted to do was burn their Coney Island building, or the hot dog building, and turn it into insurance. And so the building was burned and an investigation was launched. And the Snerd was actually used as evidence that they had planned it, because they removed him and sold him before the burning, very conveniently. And so he's got a little bit of history, interesting history there in the newspapers. The Snerd was then sold to a guy named Max Sorensen, and he purchased the Snerd to go at his bar called the Wagon Wheel in Madison, Ohio. I don't know the gentleman's last name, but I do know that a man named Warren was used to do the modifications and patch up and repaint the Giant. That's where it got its current paint scheme, was from Warren, who painted the Giant, fixed some holes, and did some repair. He modified the hat. He cut off that big brim, and he made a bill, so it was more of a ball cap rather than the big hat that Snerds normally have. And also, in order for it to fit into the Wagon Wheel bar, they had to trim off a few inches around the waist. The Snerd spent quite a few years at the Wagon Wheel. So starting in the early 80s, you have this series of years where the Snerd is in the bar and all the customers are taking pictures with it. So it's really interesting to see the progression of pictures as you go through the 80s and the 90s of these different visitors all posing with the Snerd. And he was kind of, the icon of the bar, and everybody knew about him. His name on his shirt was Warny, and the paint scheme, and he just had this iconic look, and everyone called him Warny, and it was kind of a joke, and it was just part of the Wagon Wheel bar. In 1995, you have a guy named John Hett who's really into Alfred Newman, and he's a mad collector, and it's always been speculated that the Snerds look exactly like Alfred E. Newman, and so why weren't they called that? And we don't really know the answer to that, but we know that they were called Snerds after Mortimer Snerd, who many argue he doesn't look as much like Mortimer Snerd. Maybe there was a copyright issue, we don't really know, but everyone can see that a Snerd looks like Alfred, but that is not his name. Well, John arrives in 1995 to visit the bar, and of course, he's a mad collector. He collects Mad magazine artifacts. He's really big into Alfred Newman. He is kind of like I am with Muffler Man, but in the Mad world, in the Alfred E. Newman world, and knows so much about it. And of course, he takes notice of the Snerd and keeps that in the back of his mind. Eventually, in 2007, he approaches Max, the owner, and he asks if he can borrow the Snerd for a convention. The convention was the Alfred E. Newman Art History Show at the University of East Michigan. And so John packs this guy up and hauls him over there to be on display with over 500 artifacts about Alfred E. Newman. Probably one of the highlights of the event was the fact that Albert Fieldstein was there, the late editor of Mad, and he was really taken by the Snerd and got a number of photographs with it, and really enjoyed seeing this larger-than-life representation of Alfred, even though it was called a Mortimer Snerd. When the convention came to an end, John and Max had another conversation, and it was at that time that it was decided that Max would sell the Snerd to John for the sum of $2,500. And so in 2008, John became the owner of the Snerd, and he took him to his home in Plymouth, Michigan, and he strapped him to a tree in the yard, and that was the new home of the Snerd. Now he was outside, so he was getting snow and rain, so his colors started to fade faster, but he was popular in the neighborhood, and John would load him out for weddings and receptions and barbecues and other neighborhood events. Around 2012, John decides that he's willing to sell the Snerd, and so he puts them up on eBay for a period of time. And I had started getting into Muffler Man in 2011, and of course in the beginning I am just traveling the country, I'm doing all my history, I'm doing all my research, I'm trying to find these guys everywhere, and I'm not really a collector at all. I wasn't even thinking about that in the beginning, but I really wanted to learn all I could about their history. But as time went on, I started seeing different Muffler Men occasionally appear on eBay, and you hardly see it anymore, but back in those days they were popping up here and there on eBay. I remember there was a Snerd in Pennsylvania that was on eBay. There was another torso and head of one that somebody had made into like a couch in their living room, of all things. And it was on eBay for sale. I wish now that I'd bought that. But I saw John's Snerd eventually pop up on eBay. And it was up there for a little while, and I didn't buy it, but I remember looking at the pictures. Eventually, John took it down off of eBay, and I forget exactly how I got in direct contact with him. Maybe I found it somewhere else, but eventually John and I started discussions about me possibly purchasing the Snerd. From my memories, John wanted the same amount of money that he paid for it, and that was a ton of money to me back then, and it was very difficult to make the decision to go ahead and spend that money to get half of a Giant. But I thought he was really cool, and I wanted to have a muffler man of my own in my backyard. And so in 2012, I drove up to Plymouth, Michigan, and John and I loaded the Snerd on this rig of a trailer I'd made. I've been able to purchase the legs to a Mr. Bendo on the drive up in Indianapolis, and so we put the body of the Snerd and everything on top, kind of on this frame over the legs. Here we are just leaving Detroit, and I'm stopping at every rest area and I'm checking the strap, making sure he's tied down. It's dark, it's hard to see out. It's the first time I've used this rig, so I'm a little nervous if he's riding okay, and it's hard to see out, so it's not ideal to travel with this guy at night. And I hauled this contraption all the way back to Illinois, where I was living at the time, and I really could not believe that I had finally purchased my first muffler man, and it was this Wagon Wheel Snerd. I was worried about the load because it's so big, but it traveled really well, and finished the trip up this morning, and just got in. So now he'll go into storage for a little bit, and then we'll get him restored eventually. We're just taking the bubble wrap off for the first time. A couple missing teeth and a really bad paint job. When I got him home, I spent some time setting him up in the yard. I kind of paired him with the legs that I had got, and that was my initial desire, was to use those legs for this Snerd and create a standing version of him again. But I quickly realized we had some big problems. The back of his head had been completely removed because they wanted him to fit against the wall at the wagon wheel. Also, the waist had been trimmed by a few inches, so there was no way he was going to couple up with a pair of pants because he had lost a few inches around the waist. And these were major problems for me back in 2012, and there wasn't a Mark Klein or a Bruce Kennedy around at the time that could make these repairs, and I certainly didn't have the molds to make a copy of the few inches of waist that had been trimmed off. So instead of getting restored and repaired, this Giant eventually ended up in our garden behind the house. And it was just kind of a garden decoration for many years back there, and it was nice to have a muffler man in the yard. Eventually in 2016 I got a new job, and that's the year I moved from Illinois to Colorado. And so the Snerd had to leave the house, and it was a good time to transition him to Colorado, but I still didn't know what I was going to do with him. But at that point in time, things were changing, and Bruce Kennedy was starting to had molds, and he was making muffler men, and I had just sold him a set of molds for the Mr. Bendo. And so as the molds were headed out to California, I asked Bruce if I could throw the Snerd on top of the load, and if he could restore the Snerd. Bruce had the capability to repair the back of the head and also add the waist back on that was missing. And so for the first time, it was becoming a reality that, we might be able to get this Snerd fully restored. It actually ended up being a 6-year restoration. Most of that time, the Snerd was not being worked on. The first thing Bruce did was to patch him up. He repaired the hole in the back of the head and added the back of the head, and he fixed the waist. But then it sat there in primer in his yard for many years, kind of on hold as COVID came through and all these different things happened. During this time, though, the museum was becoming a reality, and so the Snerd started entering conversations I was having with Bill Thomas about going to the museum and being part of the display there at the museum. One of the big questions we had to answer right away is, how do we paint the Snerd? Do we take him back to original, how the Snerds looked with the patches on the pants and the suspenders? And we knew he was a red shirt version with yellow suspenders. And so that was the general idea of what we would do. And then Bruce would have to add the rest of the hat back on. And I even did a survey on my Facebook page, and I asked everybody what they prefer. And everyone wanted me to take him back to original. Well, over the course of time, other things were happening. And I remember my friend Mike Whitman in Dallas, Georgia, was buying all these giants from Magic Forest. And one of them, who was like the farmer or the Amish-looking muffler man that stood at Magic Forest, that was completely restored back to an original Snerd. And I thought to myself, well, Mike's already taken this guy back to a Snerd, so there's great representations of the Snerds, as well as some of the originals that are in Dallas still painted that way. And I thought, well, I'm going to make a decision here on my own. Even though most people wanted me to return this to original, I just really like the wagon wheel story of Warny. And so it was decided to paint him and keep him in his colors from the wagon wheel. And so we used the color. We came up with the blue pants to match some of the colors on his sleeves and collar. And, of course, we removed his name, and that didn't get put back on. But I did keep the WW on his hat. And everyone wonders, what's that WW stand for? And it stands for the wagon wheel. So he was restored to look exactly the way he did when he was in the wagon wheel. But he was given legs so he could stand and be a part of the museum. In May of 2023, I flew out to California, and we loaded him into a box truck for the long journey back to Illinois. And we barely got him to fit in there. It was a little touch and go, but we got him all loaded up and strapped down. And I even got pulled over outside of St. Louis by some policemen who were probably looking for drugs and other things running through there. They pulled me over for something I don't even think I did, but I was fine with it. They just wanted to see what I had in the back. They asked me what I had in the back of the truck, and I told them, well, just some body parts. And of course, they have to have a look, and they got the joke, thankfully, and were humored about it. And we went on our way. We arrived at the American Giants Restoration Shop, which at the time was the American Giants Restoration Shop. Today, it's Regiant. And we unloaded the Snerd, as well as a bunch of other stuff for the museum that was being transported there. And the museum at this point had been built. I remember that CBS Sunday Morning was there the day we unloaded him. And they were there to do an interview with me, and we did the interview, and then we put the Snerd together. I think the guys worked a few long nights to put the internal structure in these giants. That's what Regiant does. That's one of the things they do very well, is they make internal structures that go in these giants so they can freestand on a concrete slab wherever you want to set them up. And that's exactly what they did. And a few days later, we were able to take him up to Atlanta, Illinois, and unload him off of their custom giant hauler trailer and set him up. He's the first one to stand in the giant area. That you'll notice there's additional slabs for other giants that will all be arriving in 2025, most likely. Setup went without a hitch, and the giant was set up, and he has stood there now for a few years. But that is the story of the American Giants Museum Snerd and his very interesting history.